You're listening to the Inside Commerce podcast hosted by experienced consultants James Gerd and Paul Rogers. Inside Commerce is your fast track to digital knowledge, featuring interviews with leading e-commerce retailers, industry thought leaders and the C-suite of key tech companies to explore the latest in digital strategy, customer experience and tech. Discover what the latest trends really mean and get practical advice based on experience to help fine-tune your e-commerce strategy and tech stack. Follow us on LinkedIn and reach out to James or Paul if you'd like to discuss an e-commerce project. We hope you enjoy the latest episode. Today's episode is sponsored by Centra and Greben. More about them later. And let's set the scene. Our topic is predicting user intent to improve on-site segmentation and conversion. So the principle behind this is about not wanting to treat all customers the same, not expecting that all customers are coming to your site ready to buy. And if by understanding the different signals around user intent, we can be better at communicating and targeting those people with relevancy during their user journey, that should lead to better customer experience, better commercial outcomes. So we are talking to the founder of a tool that is focused in this area specifically, David Mannheim. Welcome, David. How are you?
Yeah, I'm all right, thanks. I'm all right. I mean, we had a bit of a somber conversation about 2 minutes ago, but let's perk things up and let's say, yes, everything is all good.
Well, this is going to be, hopefully this will like elevate the spirits for a really positive conversation about what you're up to and the things you're doing with some exciting retailers like Rafa. So just a bit of background before you tell us about Made with Intent. So you were previously Global VP of CRO because you obviously like letters in your job titles at Brain Labs. You're currently a digital board advisor of some impressive brands like Current Body, who Paul knows well because he works very closely with. And you're the author of the book, Personalisation. So it's like having a mini celebrity on.
I wouldn't go that far. In fact, if you do want to add to the or less so impressive CV, I was a celebrity at one point. I would say a Z-list celebrity. I was on the famous show Take Me Out. How embarrassing is that? There you go. So talk about
amazing. That is a first on the Inside Commerce podcast. I feel like we need a gong or something going off. But so let's start with your journey, because before we get into the details around Made with Intent, and there's going to be some really interesting stuff for everyone listening, so make sure you keep listening. Is take us through your journey, because you're exiting a CRO agency, writing a book, and then launching Made with Intent. Like, why that path?
Well, it all felt kind of sequential, right? So the agency that I owned, User Conversion, I founded that in 2015. Never really wanted it, to be honest. It was all rather accidental, but there we are where we are. And I felt like throughout that process, I'm a practitioner, right? I really care about doing things in the right way, as most practitioners would say so. And I felt as though we were just optimizing for revenue. And I think when you optimize them purely on everything for revenue, you get the e-commerce stores that we see nowadays, right? Pop-ups flying in front of our face saying, hey, why don't you do this for 10% off? Please buy in session. That way we can attribute it. Here, Google, here's loads of money, because we know we can attribute that because acquisition is easier than retention. Yada, yada, yada. So I felt a little bit of, needed a bit of salt for the chip on my shoulder, put it that way. Anyway, when I sold that, I decided to explore those feelings a little bit more, both in therapy and in 80,000 words. So I interviewed, it's about 150 odd, I think it was, 150 odd practitioners from around the world, mostly centered around this concept of personalization, because I feel like personalization should all be about being personal with one another. And I feel as though we've lost that connection between e-commerce brands and the person on the other side of the screen. So I don't know, and we could talk about football if you want, but that coupled with my love for football kind of created this weird ikigai moment. This what you need, what you have, what you love, what you can sell. And I had to explore it. I had to create a hypothesis and see if this thing would work. And here we are today. It works.
Greben create digital flagship stores for iconic brands of today and tomorrow. We are the #1 Centra agency in the world, with more than 50 Centra implementations to date. We are also e-commerce design specialists, platform and tech partner agnostic. Try our new e-commerce design subscription. Visit greben.com.
Right. Yeah, I think, that's an interesting topic. We could do a podcast on some of that stuff in itself, to be honest, like the whole kind of like bottom of funnel experience that everyone seems to be moving towards at the moment. not really like building for new customers. But yeah, I think we'll talk a bit more about that later on. So I guess first question for me, like how and why did you land on predicting or like the business? Like how did you kind of, because I think the thing that I found quite interesting was the role that you're playing, and you're not trying to do everything. You're kind of really kind of specializing or honing in on like the underlying data. So yeah, like what was the initial kind of idea? Yeah, where did it come from?
I guess that's the football route, being honest. So we might as well jump right into it as a United fan speaking to a Liverpool fan. The whole idea of expected goals is really one that I was fascinated. You remember when football went away, the whole European Super League, this little thing called COVID, meant that the Bundesliga was the only thing on in the world. I started reading up on books and specifically the XG philosophy. So the idea of XG, expected goals, was it's not about the quantity of shots that you have against a goal, a net. It's about the quality of that chance. And by flipping that perspective, it meant that tactics and strategies could be much more focused on, thank you, Pep, but tiki-taka football or the type of chance that one would have, less so the whether you're pinging the ball from 30 yards or 2 foot away. And so the concept of XG was born. It took about 5 years to get on Match of the Day, and it really has transformed the way that football matches are played. Some would argue for the worse, okay, but there are more goals now than ever before. The football quality is the highest that it's ever been, arguably, and the idea of predictive analytics permeates through every sport. Starting in baseball, we've all seen Moneyball, great film. Went through to tennis, went through to rugby, it's in golf, it's in curling, it's in everything you do. And I just feel, Paul, that the problems that we're trying to be solved within football, the quantity of chances, feels like the same problems that exist in e-commerce. The idea of we're going to shove everything at the top of the hopper and see what falls out. So that's kind of where the idea originated from. I'm going to thank football for that, or my love for it. And then again, my mixed with the chip on my shoulder helped create this hypothesis.
And I guess what was your, and I should just check that we're not covering this later on. I don't think we are, but like, what was your thinking behind, and this might just be the stage you're at, it might be because of kind of how you're going to market, like people like Bloomreach, and you mentioned dynamic yield earlier. But what was the thinking, I guess, behind just focusing in on that data rather than, the whole kind of front end serving presentation element? Is it that you just think that there's room for someone to really like specialize in that area and I guess, build out more data points and better understand segments? Yeah. What was the reasoning?
Well, being honest, is an iterative reasoning. So our go-to-market was exactly that. We thought we'd be a front-end layer as well. Maybe a personalisation platform you could call us. At the end of the day, I literally wrote the book on it, right? So it feels quite natural to translate to there. What we found, though, is that people started to pigeonhole us in this, what was effectively a pop-up merchant. Nudge, 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 pop-up, pop-up, pop-up. And that's almost the antithesis of what we're doing. We also found, Paul, that one of our biggest personas was CRM teams. It was all about customer lifetime value. It's not just about what happens on site, but if you understand the intent after they've left, you can be more appropriate to them. So by not having a front-end layer, and instead by integrating into those platforms, our ICP widened, our personas widened, and we became more of an authority than, dare I say, a pop-up merchant. Am I going to get told off for that? I'm not, am I? Nah.
Should be fine.
Centra is the only commerce platform built exclusively for fashion brands. Over 300 fashion brands run on Centra, including icons like Paul Smith, Jeff, Avenue, and Nudie Jeans. Centra solves business logic challenges for fashion brands like no other platform, and they are on a mission to help you scale up rapidly, globally, across all online and offline channels. Take your fashion brand global, faster, further, stronger today. I think let's add a bit of context and quantification, David, because when we talked prior to this recording, we were talking about the ubiquity of these. You're right. You come on a site, sign up for the newsletter, get 10% off, and to varying degrees of like hassling and like not letting you go until you've closed the pop-up several times. And a lot of retailers become dependent on them because they see the data and the data says they get people and people spend and it's like tick success. But you talked about that less is more. So can you, from your point of view, from what you're seeing, and from the strategic perspective and the data analyst, what are the issues with generic 10% pop-up for newsletter, and how has your intent to help prove that sometimes less is more?
Well, those types of tactics are designed for everyone, but only impact the few. You know full well, if you land on a website that has a, hey, 10% off, sign up for our newsletter, immediately as you land, all you see is that big fat X, or in some cases, the small X, or the worst culprits are the really passive-aggressive ones. Have you seen this? Where the call to action is, no, I don't need money off today, thank you, I'm happy paying full price. Big fuck off to them. I'm allowed to swear, yeah.
Yeah, to be honest, they deserve that for that. Just that. We think it's clever copy.
Isn't it the most passive aggressive thing you've ever seen on any website ever?
A patronising as hell.
You know what? Ironically, it does work psychologically, anyways. So we tested a few functions. I'll give you 3 examples. I'll give you the newsletter example, social proof, probably one of my favorites, and discounting. So in terms of newsletters, the hypothesis here is that as soon as someone lands on the site and you get given a new user and you get given a pop-up for 10% off, is less really more? We've tested this across about between 6 and 10 retailers. And we found that yes, although you're serving a pop-up to somebody and it therefore has less impressions, the number of subscriptions that occur is inherently more. One example of that is where we, instead of serving it as soon as somebody lands, serving it when they're likely to leave, their intent to exit. Intent isn't just about purchase, by the way. Their intent to exit increases. So before the action actually happens, we saw that very same pop-up is served 66% less, but the number of subscriptions increases by 29%. That's on just one of those retailers. Less is more, quality does beat quantity. I found that really interesting. My second favorite example, we'll go for discounting straight away. The whole concept of giving discounts to those who are going to buy anyways feels a little bit parochial, feels a bit redundant, doesn't it? So if you're able to identify users who are ready to buy, who have a high intent, then we can almost exclude those from any discounts that are given. And yes, your conversion rate might ultimately decrease because some of those users of that segment will not end up not purchasing. But guess what? You're saving your margin because the vast majority of them will. So we work with an electronics retailer and we managed to save a very specific discount for them. We managed to save their margin by about 42% decrease because you're identifying users who are ready to buy. The adverse happens, by the way. So instead of just looking at users who might be ready to buy and excluding something from them, think about the adverse of users who are never going to buy. So why would you remarket to them? This isn't a client of ours, but one of my favorite stories is that of Land Rover, where this is years ago, by the way. So forgive me if Land Rover are listening. I'm sure they've changed this now. But to get through to a test drive, you have to go through the car configurator. And they were remarketing to use all users going through the car configurator who hadn't completed a test drive. Now, guess what? Can you guess the average age of the audience that were going through the car configurator? It's 14-year-old boys pissing about dreaming with their dream car. They have no intent to purchase whatsoever. They are literally tire kickers. You could call them tire kickers. So think of those who are ready to buy and those who aren't ready to buy. I could give you another example of social proof, but you can start to see how less is indeed more.
That makes sense. So I guess moving on to the kind of how you're segmenting customers. So you mentioned earlier that you have around 250 different signals for predicting intent. How are you bucketing or grouping those intents against customers? What are the different stages that you're looking at?
So we just call it context at the end of the day. All we're doing is we're collecting context from users that are more appropriate to how people actually buy. So the very first thing we do is that we bucket them into an objective. Because guess what? Your website isn't all about conversion. So we have engage, build intent, maintain intent, and then convert. Those are generally the 4 objectives of what any website should be achieving at any point in time. We have segments per objective. So there are different segments that we would bucket users into when you need to engage them versus different segments of users when you need to build intent, persuade, remove anxieties, that type of thing. And within each of those, we have different states, things like focus or abandon or struggle. And the segments are generally named things like focus shoppers, last chances, the types of people that have a really high intent to purchase, a high intent of leaving, and a low intent to return. Feels like your last chance to grab them, right? So we take all those signals, we model them together, we smoosh them together in a lovely LLM, and we basically bucket them into those different segments that are more appropriate to how they buy and therefore your objectives. That makes sense, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I have a sub question on top of this. I guess you've probably got like a bit of a framework, or you've definitely got a framework. But how custom is each implementation? So that I have an example of a client at the moment. They sell high-end furniture, and I'm trying to get them to test more kind of lead gen orientated approaches and micro conversions and, maybe taking people through different journeys rather than just trying to get them to transact on like a £10,000 piece of furniture. And I'd imagine like the kind of event structure would be quite different to maybe like the average fashion brand. Like how would you approach that? Or like is it a case of that it's more standardized, or is there a lot of like bespokeness to it?
No, it's completely standardized. Again, we tested these approach rigorously, and ultimately we fell back to what happens in football, whereas every game is the same. There's 90 minutes with 22 players on the pitch, 2 goals, usually an offense and a defense. The structure and the attributes of a football game are exactly the same. Just in the same way that the structures and the attributes of an e-commerce site is exactly the same. Okay, there's always a series of products that require adding to baskets. That is slightly more complex, yes, granted, that requires a purchase, and you need to find those products and filter and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the structure and the attributes are the same, but the weighting is different. So granted, you're right, the need for filters for a furniture brand might be different than that of like an ASOS, for example. So it's the prioritization of those attributes that are different. We found by having a universal large language model that's trained on over 75 different retailers, so there's no degradation in quality versus a standardized LLM that predicts intent, certainly not in accuracy or prediction, and in fact allows you to benchmark at the same time against other people who, how good are they at building intent? How good are they engaging? What's their intent to purchase on users who come from paid media campaigns, that type of stuff. So for us, the answer is no. A universal large language model is usually, we find, has no degradation and has those added benefits. So yeah, that's where we've taken things.
Something I come up against a lot of the time, and I'm sure you'll be the same, is that a lot of e-commerce retailers have short-term trading mentality. They've got targets, pressures, and that leads to a lot of this ubiquitous like 10% off, 20% off, blanket discounting. And it can therefore sometimes be hard for them to change approaches. You work with lots of different people, so I'd love to hear from this. What's the business case? Because what's the proposition to them? How is user intent analysis going to help them demonstrate to, whether it's a C-suite or a director or a head of, that actually just constantly slashing prices and doing discounting isn't always the optimal way to convert?
Yeah, you bang on. I mean, that's the enemy, isn't it? Short-termism. The enemy isn't really conversion rate. That's just a measure of success of the enemy. It's the same in the CRO agency that I founded. That's one of the problems that I felt, is that we were always optimizing for the conversion. I know that's what the name suggests. It's not what the process is intended to be, though. Because you're meant to convert to support you're meant to optimize to support users through a journey, right? Not just, let's shove some social proof here, there, and everywhere. Sticky add to carts, fill your boots. That's generally what happens, isn't it? So yeah, our mission, James, is to change the perspective of e-commerce for the better. Okay, there's a few things in there. Number one, to change behavior, you need to first change attitude. So this concept of changing perspective, it's all us, right? Number two, we call ourselves Moneyball for e-commerce, self-proclaimed. That's what happened in Moneyball. Someone has to dance first for others to dance, right? And I feel as though we trademark the term XC. See? It's exactly the same as expected goals. We trademark the term XC for expected conversion because we feel by having a more predictive, real-time, almost two-way measure of customer satisfaction and business objectives, rather than something that's binary and retrospective and aggregated, like conversion rate, we feel that's the start of the movement. Does it sound quite culty? It's not intended to be, but it's definitely intended to be done for the better, right? For the betterment of e-commerce in general.
Great. And so you work with around 25 customers I've got written here, but earlier you said 75, so it might be a bit higher. And that, includes brands like Rafa and Benson.
Yeah.
Can you talk us through maybe a couple of case studies around kind of how people are using the product? Because going through the site, it's some really interesting, like interactive examples of like how you can build up the data. But it'd be interesting to know like, how some of these brands are then going on to use the data, or whether it is kind of, the CRM teams using it, or, they're doing more on the front end, or, there's a team of analysts just trying to understand customers. So yeah, if you've got a couple of case studies.
Yeah, of course. So we generally have three use cases, right? Number one is insights. It's fairly obvious, but you can identify and prioritize segments based on user intent to purchase, to exit, or return. So understand the intent of visitors is a really nice case study. Sea Salt Cornwall, Cotswold Outdoors, they use us in conjunction with our Content Square and Hotjar integrations, for example. Because if I were them, and they've said this themselves, if I were them, I don't care just about how users generically use a PDP or a PLP. I care about how they differ between users who are browsing versus those users that are committing. Okay, and so I think that really helps them prioritize what to do in their experience and experimentation programs. Use case number two is all about in-session intent. Fairly obvious, but you can start to target users in session who have a high intent to purchase versus those who have a low intent to purchase. And your objectives should be different, right? You can either target visitors who are likely to exit, like the newsletter example that I gave you, or you can convert visitors who are ready to buy. In that case, you can just leave them the hell alone if you really wanted to, or you can prioritize social proof. Well, probably one of my favorites is, I think Rafa did this. You can start to build an intent with users who are already engaged on different visits. So for example, if a user comes back to your site, it's not enough just giving them a recently viewed mechanism. You recently viewed these products, okay? If they have a low intent to purchase, it might be useful giving them more than one suggestion or talking about categories, rather than if they have a high intent to purchase, talk about that single product more, okay? That makes sense, right? I.e., if they have a really high intent, it suggests that they're past some of the stages that you would do in product discovery. So talking about that one product really help them engage, not just with that module, but overall for that segment of users. I think it was like a 7 or 8% increase for that segment. In revenue, by the way, we don't really measure conversion. And finally, probably our most popular use cases are those post-visit. So prioritizing and engaging with prospects in your email database or your remarketing activity. So we integrate really well with like Meta for remarketing stuff, like the Land Rover example I gave before. Or we integrate really well with, say, a Blue Reach or an Emetria. Because at the end of the day, the way you speak to customers with a low intent should be different than a high intent. So I can give you examples of, I gave you the discount example before. I could give you a Rafa, exclude all low intent users from their remarketing activity. And only when they have a higher level of intent do they start to speak to users in their remarketing on meta campaigns and social campaigns. Or indeed, they change their message. If they have a low intent, talk about the brand values. If they have a higher intent, well, talk about the specific products or the logistics of the purchase. I think it's all about what we call appropriateness. So be more appropriate in how you communicate with your audience. And if you can segment that audience based on how they really buy, then you can start to create a lot more impact in those communication methodologies. Don't assume everybody's ready to buy, which I think feels like a normalized statement, but it's true.
It is, the whole area of like custom communications around emails, SMS, whatever channel people are sending out their regular comms in. There are a lot of platforms that really call for flow based and have all of the tooling to do the advanced segmentation, but not necessarily the data insight to create those meaningful segments to tailor the messaging. So I think that's really interesting. So let's drill into that a bit more, because you don't do the personalization. You are basically a data and intent modeling engine that gives other tools the intelligence to be able to execute it. So it'd be really useful to know, you've mentioned a few vendors during the podcast, but what are the key vendors you currently integrate with? And then what are the options? So if somebody really loves the idea of the tool, but they've got a different third party, what are the integration options for people you don't have a pre-integration with?
So we surface everything on the front end in the data layer. So if you're an integrator, a vendor, just grab it. Pretty simple stuff. But we have native integrations. I think we're about 7 different vendors now. We're only babies, right? But Bluereach, Geometria, Klaviyo, Meta tend to be the post-visit stuff. And then in the insight stuff, it's Hotjar, Content Square, same thing nowadays. GA, Adobe Analytics. And then in session, actually don't think we have any native integrations of in session. You could count Bluereach as one of those, I suppose. AB Tasty, Dynamic Yield, they're all pretty easy to integrate with regardless. We're just waiting for a use case.
And I get just sub question on that. I was just interested. So at the moment, I'd assume a lot of your implementation is either like custom JavaScript or like by GTM or something like that. Do you have any intention to build out like platform specific integration and like move into like Shopify's ecosystem more, for example?
It's probably not within our core ICP right now. Startup, just over a year old, ruthlessly prioritized. So currently, in fact, just yesterday, hot off the press, we have finally got our GTM native template all set up on the store. We didn't even get an email. We've just been waiting months and months and months for confirmation. But we've given templates out for a while now. So largely just GTM template-based integration. It's pretty simple. We don't collect any PII. It's just tracking behavior at the end of the day. It's the stuff at the back end that's the sexy stuff, the LLM that models everything out into meaning, really, into context.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then the last question for me before James asks the last question overall. What size does the business need to be to have enough signals to really like get value from the product? And I can see you've got a bit of a mix of like bigger and smaller businesses on the website. But do you think it's a case of, you need a certain level of traffic to really feed the model and get the value from it?
It's less so the amount of traffic, I would say. And it's more so your maturity, because everything at the end of the day, it's a universal model. So it's all propped up in some ways by everybody else's data, not just yours. And it's more so your maturity. So for example, our ICP is generally, we're not talking data scientists with Farfetch, right? Probably a bit too mature. We're also not talking Shopify mom and pops who do a bit of side things on Etsy. We're talking about, ideally someone would have a CDP or some kind of ESP that's a little bit more mature. And what I would say in the post-visit stuff, we take somebody from immediate to advanced, intermediate to advanced. And with the in-session stuff, they're likely doing some A/B testing, as you can imagine. But let's be candid here, the majority of people are doing rather basic A/B testing. Hands up if you've thrown a sticky CTA on your site in the past 2 months. Or you're working in pages, PLP, PDP, basket checkout. That's how you optimize, is page templates. Whereas really you should be thinking about stages, browsing, committing, evaluating. So we do say hashtag stages, not pages. That's generally, the data maturity is more important than the traffic, I would say.
And what's I would like this question for like founders and where they're headed strategically in vision is, what is your vision for the future? Like, where are you headed? Is this just about continuing doing what you're doing, or is it about evolving the product?
You know what? It's not evolving the product at all. It's evolving the market. And again, I appreciate that sounds culty, but just appreciate like the journey at least, which is I've gone from an accidental agency owner to cathartically writing out 80,000 words in a book with a hell of a lot of research behind it. Having, let's be candid here, having loads of panic attacks in my previous business because I had conflict about I had to own this thing that I didn't want to own. The one thing I can tell you with this is that there's so much purpose behind it. I can't begin to describe it. And okay, like the love of football, the inspiration behind that really props that up as well. So that's why I called it my Ikigai moment. So the vision, being honest, is for over half of all global retailers to be using intent in some form. And we call this Moneyball for e-commerce. I know full well others will quote unquote copy this. It doesn't really exist right now. Spotify uses intent as the personalisation framework that they have. So do Netflix. Google, what do you think Rank Brain was in 2019? Intent is everywhere in what we do. It's just not in e-commerce. I want to bring it to e-commerce. So copy us, by all means. We're just here to be the authority in it.
I like that. I like that bold statement. And earlier mover advantage is always useful and beneficial. But I've really enjoyed this. I've enjoyed both chats we've had in the recent weeks, and it's a really cool project. I'm hoping that I can find the right project to work with you guys on and be a lot of fun. But I agree. I think the principle about predictive intent is really, really important, and not treating people all the same. Because the historical view of you optimize a page, a template, versus that there is different user journeys for different types of browsers based on their intent, and that actually a template isn't just a fixed thing. It can be a dynamic thing depending on who's viewing it and for what purposes. I think that scares a lot of people off, but I guess my final question then linked to that is, so I think sometimes people think, oh my God, this is like really complex. How do people start simply to not overcomplicate things? What's your advice to people when people come and go, but this feels like it's optimizing an entire site for all of the different users for intent? I can't possibly execute that. What's your advice? How do you start small and actually prove it and get some benefit from it?
Well, exactly that. Number one, you either treat it as a framework, i.e. the way I'm going to personalize or segment the audiences in my site is not arbitrarily on page templates. That's ridiculous. That's not how people buy. Nor is it on attributes like new versus returning. I'm sorry, that doesn't exist anymore. It's based on their intent to purchase. It's guiding users and holding their hand throughout that journey. So either A, use it as a framework, or B, you're right, start small. Take it, how about this? Challenge you. Take an A/B test that you've run, if you're there, segment it by intent and see what happens. I can give you evidence right now, if you'd like, that if you were to segment your latest social proof experiment that you ran, to put 50 people have also purchased this on the website, and you segment that experiment by the intent of the user, what you will most likely find, as we have found, is that type of messaging works really well for users who have a high level of intent that need a level of persuasion, but really poorly to the point where it's detrimental for those users who have a low level of intent. They are not there yet. That's like turning around to a user and saying, you know what, I'm wearing some lace knickies. Knickies? What's a knicky? Knickers. I'm wearing some lace knickers. It's just an invitation and it turns them off. Prioritize the content that needs to be prioritized. Test on intent based on what you already are doing.
There's a good. It's good to end a podcast episode on a challenge. And if anyone listening wants to like discuss any of this, challenge you, find out more, talk about how they could actually do that in their testing framework, how do they reach out?
I'm usually ranting, probably with a drone, on LinkedIn somewhere. But madeofintent.ai is our URL. We have a lot of nice content out there. Today we literally released a learning center, which I think is quite cool, some articles and playbooks. So yeah, through those mechanisms.
Cool. Obviously on our landing page, when you're listening to this, go to insidecommerce.fm and there will be a link to David on LinkedIn as well. David, really enjoyed this. Thanks. We could definitely sit here and talk for hours, but I know that people eventually fall asleep listening because podcast listeners have a finite attention span. So yeah, thanks for taking the time and look forward to hearing the latest news on the journey to world domination.
We haven't got that far, but thanks, James. Thanks, Paul.
Cheers. And thanks everyone for listening. Make sure you're following us on LinkedIn and have subscribed to the Inside Commerce newsletter. We drop it every 2 weeks. Take care, everyone. You're listening to the Inside Commerce podcast hosted by experienced consultants James Gerd and Paul Rogers. Inside Commerce is your fast track to digital knowledge, featuring interviews with leading e-commerce retailers, industry thought leaders, and the C-suite of key tech companies to explore the latest in digital strategy, customer experience, and tech. Discover what the latest trends really mean and get practical advice based on experience to help fine-tune your e-commerce strategy and tech stack. Follow us on LinkedIn and reach out to James or Paul if you'd like to discuss an e-commerce project. We hope you enjoy the latest episode.